My name is Bob Finch, and the company I founded actually in 2010 is called Select Spectrum. And we are a brokerage and consulting firm working in a variety of spectrum bands now. But in fact, my heritage goes back to the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. I started working in this band way back in 1998 when I was at WorldCom, before WorldCom eventually acquired quite a few 2.5 gigahertz spectrum licenses. I was the advocate for that initiative. And I've spent the majority of the last 20 years working on 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. Over the past 2.5 years, as many will know, James Bridges was my colleague at Select Spectrum and was running our auction process. And we'll be talking a little bit about the auctions for 2.5 gigahertz later. But James has resigned to go back to his prior business, which is actually automotive. He's actually also working closer to where his family home is now. So we're missing him, but it gives me a chance to get back into the nitty-gritty of 2.5 gigahertz, which I love. And it will also give us a chance to bring on a new person. We're expecting to hire a replacement for James here very soon. So in the presentation today, we have just a small number of attendees, and so that actually makes it very easy to make this interactive. You have two choices in terms of any questions that come up as you go through this. The first is to just type in a question. You should see a question box actually on your webinar screen, and the other is to click the little raise your hand button, and at that point I'll see the question come up on my screen, and Zach will also be monitoring for any questions that come up. You're on mute. Those attendees are on mute at the moment, but we can unmute you, and you can go ahead and ask your question over the computer, or if you're on by phone, either of those should work. So your choice, but I much prefer to make this an interactive discussion if that's possible. So we also have a number of materials available on our website. If you go to selectspectrum.com, and then you can either go through the services page or through the available Spectrum 2.5 gigahertz page. But probably easiest is to services. There's a subpage called Spectrum Lease Auction. We provide a great deal of information available on that site, and some of which I'll be discussing here during the call today. So in terms of the outline of the discussion today, our plan is to talk about the basics of 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, description of the FCC rules, talk about the pros and cons. We'll describe in some detail the technology and uses. We'll describe the acquisition process, how you obtain either a license or a lease, and then end with a description of our spectrum lease auction. The timing on that, first bids will be due by April 12th, and we actually have sign up due by April 3rd. So that's coming up very quickly. And then we'll do additional Q&A at the end. But as I said, it would be better if you ask your questions as we move along. So first of all, in terms of the band, this is dedicated spectrum. It's not shared spectrum. There's up to 194 megahertz available in the band overall. At this point, it's probably not possible for any new acquirer to acquire rights to the full band. But in some places, 2, 3, and 4 full licenses are available. And if you see, each license is actually a combination. It's typically 4 channels per license. That's not always the case, but generally. So if you look, for example, at the A1, A2, A3, that's all typically part of one license. And then the A4 would be also part of that same license. So 3 times 5.5 megahertz is 16. plus an additional 6 megahertz, so that makes 22.5 megahertz. And in this band plan, the licenses that are most available for WISP use for current new operators to obtain access are the educational broadband service channels, EBS channels. There's also, those are typically licensed to schools, sometimes to educational nonprofits, but they are available for lease. And so that's why we call this a spectrum lease auction, as the majority of our transactions are leases, and the majority of the leases are actually 30 years in length. So it gives you almost the same capabilities as ownership. The other portion of the band that's shown here in the green and mostly in the blue is the commercial portion of the band. It has mostly a similar structure in terms of the channels that are available, and comprises about 3/5 of the band. I'm sorry, 3/8 of the band overall, with the other 5/8 being allocated to educational spectrum. So that's the overall band. On a geographic basis, so having looked at it spectrally, here's the geographic look. This on the left here, you see a license that had a total of 35-mile radius from a center point. These were originally for the purpose of educational broadcasting TV channels, and the FCC later came along and said, no, these can be used for fixed wireless access, typically in those days like replacing T1s, that kind of thing, or they can now be used for mobile services. So we'll talk about the different uses. For most new acquirers in the band, it will be a fixed service type arrangement. So where these this, by the way, is in Iowa, is this particular license, which has a full 35-mile radius. In Texas, here's a more typical example, is where the licenses were closer together than 70 miles. You know, if it's less than 70 miles from original transmit tower to original transmit tower, then the licenses will overlap, and we call this splitting the football. You can imagine a football shape where those two licenses would overlap, and it just gets split into each license having responsibility for a particular area. So while there was originally going to be one license only, the license holders can now put as many towers as they like in a particular geographic service area for each license. There are some limits in terms of total power transmission levels at the border, but overall you're able to provide good coverage and essentially as many towers as makes sense for your network purpose. I am going to talk also about a future licensing possibility. This is not today, it's upcoming, but in much of the country, and here's an example in Colorado, there are counties with no licenses at all. This is typically west of the Mississippi, although there are some to the east of the Mississippi. And in these cases, we're pushing a program where essentially educators would go to the FCC, push for the FCC to once again accept applications for licenses, and in turn the educators could either build their own systems or lease them. So if you have more interest in this, please contact me. I would say after the auction, because we're pretty busy until the auction. And in fact, I'll probably be turning this over to our new employee. But we have a program. We've been working with the FCC. I've actually been over to Capitol Hill and met with congressional staff about this. And there is a consensus plan that would make many more licenses available. So that's potentially very, very good news in terms of those operators who are in places where there are not any licenses available at the moment. So why is it that you would want to pay money to use these licenses? Well, first of all, freedom from any other interference. These are dedicated channels, so you won't have to cope with any in-band interference or co-channel interference. Because they're dedicated, higher power levels are allowed, and these systems, in fact, can go through a reasonable amount of foliage and over and around obstructions. So much better performance than what you're used to in a more line of sight, unlicensed type environment. You can now use LTE standard equipment. We'll talk a little bit about the costs of that later, but it's coming down, and the quality, speed of transmission, the the total carrying capacity of these systems is going up very significantly. And we think that by not having to deal with interference issues, you're going to, and having higher power levels and therefore better margins, you'll have much lower maintenance costs. Also, the spectrum leases are not in the form of pay up front. You're allowed to pay as you go and only acquire the amount of license that you need. So because this is leased, I think of it as built-in financing. It also provides, when someone comes along, should their time ever come to sell the business, we think that the value is increased by having licensed spectrum. And then in some cases, it may even be possible to do a roaming agreement where Sprint traffic coming onto into your area, if Sprint hasn't built its own network in that area, they may be willing to consider roaming onto your network. There hasn't been a lot of that yet, but we think the chances are improving for that over time. So disadvantages, obviously you got to buy the or lease the spectrum. The equipment is still a little bit more expensive than the unlicensed equipment. There's limit to the number of licenses, and potentially you need more than one. We hear different things from different operators on this. I think they'd all like to have more than one license in order to operate unlicensed spectrum. Some really require it to have at least two. Others have said no, they're willing to get by with just one license. And the biggest disadvantage is realistically that these licenses are just not available everywhere. So that relates to the program I was mentioning earlier about coming up with a way to apply for licenses in places where they've not already been allocated. So talked about LTE. The predecessor to this was a form of wireless DOCSIS. That's the cable modem standard. Expedience was a system that ultimately was acquired by Motorola. Of course, WiMAX was Sprint's initial deployment. They've now switched over to LTE. And essentially all these technologies used a time division duplex approach, meaning that they transmit and receive on the same frequency and just alternate times in very short intervals. So this gives flexibility, for example, to set more time on the downlink rather than the uplink, allowing for streaming downstream and videos and that kind of thing. We think this is a significant advantage compared to other types of communications, so more conventional cellular frequency division duplex type approaches. You see the maximum base station limit, 2,000 watts ERP, according to the FCC rules. Obviously, we don't expect most transmitters will go this hot, but that's potentially the capability, and you can see how well that would propagate compared to unlicensed spectrum. And Sprint, to show that the capabilities of this system, Sprint is using this for more than half of its mobile data. So although Sprint's been in operation a long time on 800 and 1900 megahertz, more than half of their data traffic is now on these 2.5 gigahertz bands, which are not built everywhere by Sprint. They cover, I think, something over half of the country, but they're focused in really urban and suburban areas and not in the outer rural areas. We understand from talking with manufacturers and other WISPs that up to 100 megabits is feasible in 20 megahertz. So you can think about, very, very high performance from these systems for your customers. And the fact that all of these devices are being produced, including for the Japanese and Chinese markets, mean that there's huge numbers of devices and base stations out there, most of them mobile, but even so, the chipsets are common between the mobile device and the fixed customer CPE. So that really provides a significant overall advantage in terms of the cost curve, and we think that we'll continue to see significant cost advantages. So while most educators have leased to Sprint or to a fixed wireless operator, like the companies that are listening on this call, some spectrum still remains available. We have seen companies including Rise Broadband and Whisper ISP, a lot of other fixed wireless operators have been leasing 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, or in some cases acquiring the licenses. And so in total, there's 50 U.S. operators that have acquired 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. And for all the factors we mentioned above, it's becoming increasingly popular. Altogether, there's something on the order of 1,800 leases around the country, a large number of them with Sprint, but also shared among these other 49 entities that are providing service. So we like to think at Select Spectrum that we've been partially responsible for the interest in this band. We have held auctions since 2014. In the last 2 years, we actually did 2 a year. So I think that brings us to this being our auction number 8. We've so far offered almost 600 EBS and BRS licenses. We've had 120 bidders, nearly 400 bids. To date, we've completed 90 transactions. So 90 parties, there's 90 licenses that have been leased to a variety of parties. And we have multiple additional leases under negotiation. Our values have ranged from rather cheap to rather pricey by spectrum standards, or at least by 2.5 gigahertz spectrum standards, still a lot less than any kind of pricing that one would pay in the, say, the cellular type operations. And this megahertz pop, I'll explain it in more detail, but it's, you know, megahertz pops are to spectrum what gallons are to gasoline, or bushels are to corn, I suppose. And here are the licenses that we plan to offer in the spring 2018 spectrum lease auction. As you can see, they cover a significant percentage of the geography of the country. And you can also see that they're divided here between 2 different categories. The dark blue are licenses where we have actually contracted with the license holder, and in some cases these are actually leaseholders where they've currently got a lease in place for the license to offer the licenses in our auction process. The lighter blue, which actually is the majority of the licenses, are held by schools, and we've done research. In some cases, we've contacted the schools. Some cases, members of the school's administration have actually said, yes, we'd like to offer these licenses. But what we found is some obstacle has prevented us from being able to sign up the schools to offer the license specifically. In a lot of cases, this is just bureaucratic issues where parties at the schools don't understand that they hold the license, or they don't understand or have the time to understand our auction process. So instead of forcing them to actually sign an offering agreement, we are offering the licenses to bidders in the auction. The bidders sign a bidder agreement, so you know, they're competing to make an offer to the schools, and we may have multiple bidders make offers for a particular license. And we take the offers to the school. We explain again the auction process, but now we've actually got concrete bids in hand, perhaps $10,000 up front and $1,000 a month, something like that. Will convince the schools that indeed, even though they didn't sign up for the auction, they should go ahead and accept one of the offers placed by the bidders. So we find this process has been very successful, and over time we've completed over 80 successful lease assignments through our auction process. And in many of those cases, they were situations where the school did not initially sign up. They were effectively the equivalent of the light blue licenses shown here. I did want to mention, if you notice that on the last slide you didn't see any licenses available, we have an additional program that we're looking at that would be a chance to get access to licensed spectrum. This is really oriented towards allowing our client that holds upper 700 megahertz A block licenses to get those licenses renewed. And so if you operate in any of these areas, predominantly in the east or certain portions of the west, as you see there, you certainly should reach out to us, talk to my colleague Bill Sorrell here in the office. Look on our website. We call it an individual internet service program, and it's the opportunity to be paid $30,000, and the client also pays for the equipment to provide, I would say, mediocre internet service. This is only a 2 megahertz channel, and the main goal of this is to provide service to one party in a county and also meet the FCC requirements for renewing the license. So that's something to take a look at. I thought it would be worthwhile to come back to the 2.5 gigahertz now and talk about what the value of this license is. In this case, we've actually raised our estimated value based on increasing demand for these licenses, based on increasing interest from a number of parties, to 5 cents per megahertz pop. Previously, it was 4 cents per megahertz pop. And the way that would work in a typical case, we looked at a license. This one I think was based in Oklahoma, but it's fairly typical for a mostly rural license. Within the multiple counties that it covered, there were 120,000 residents. So we call that 120,000 pops. As I mentioned earlier, the typical license is 22.5 megahertz. So if you multiply those two figures together, you get 22.5 megahertz pops. And the total then, 22.5 megahertz pops times 120,000 pops is 2.7 million megahertz pops. I apologize if I didn't say that correctly. So that's a typical value in a semi-rural area. At 5 cents, that becomes equal to $135,000 in value. And so a typical payment structure for a lease of that type, we typically use a 10% discount rate for future values under the lease, 10% per annum. Would work out to be $13,500 upfront, initial monthly payments of $782, and an annual increase of 3%. Now, different numbers could also end up, you could have something that has more upfront payments or no annual increase. There are different versions, different ways to get to the $135,000. And that's not the price you have to bid. You can bid higher, you can bid lower. It really is a question of what sense does it make for your business. But we provide a spreadsheet. You can go through and figure for any of the licenses based on the pops and the megahertz, what the expected value of the license is, and then choose to offer that value or a different value that's higher or lower. Obviously, the lower you offer, the more money you save, I suppose, the better deal you get. But obviously, we also have to convince the license holder that it's worth accepting your offer. So it's a classic estimate of how much is a particular item worth. And these vary quite a bit from location to location. In general, in the auction process, we accept your first offer, and some schools will, if there's only one offer and a decent offer comes through, they'll just accept it. Other schools will ask for a higher offer, or will, if there's more than one offer, they will ask for additional offers, higher level offers, or even come back with a counter proposal. So once this initial step has been taken, the auction really goes in a direction that is individualized and really driven by the decision of the license holder, although we do provide input and suggestions. And to be clear here, we are paid on a commission basis. So if the lease goes for a higher value, we make slightly more. So all of this information is available on our website in terms of maps of the auction summary. This valuation spreadsheet that I just talked about is available, the bid form that you'll ultimately fill out, contact information for us. And by the way, there's additional information. There's a webinar coming up that we're going to do next week on the 5th at 2 o'clock Eastern to walk through how to place a bid, but there's also a previously recorded webinar that describes that. And generally, it's a web-based process. We can also accept, if you have lots of bids, you can send us a spreadsheet with multiple bids on it. The way we work at this is that all the bids are going to be due by 11 p.m. on April 12th, which is a Thursday, and we will not look at them until then. If you want us to look at a test bid, we can do that, but in general, we will not be looking at the bids until after the deadline. At that point, we go through and evaluate all the bids and submit them to the offering parties, the parties that hold the licenses, and then work with them to come to an agreement with bidders, and kind of a one-by-one, location by location, license by license basis. So if you have questions at the moment, now would be a good time to click the questions line on your control panel for the webinar,